Welcome to the third dimension. Months of Saudi talks with the Houthis have produced a 3-year roadmap which was announced by the United Nations envoy Hans Grunberg on December the 23rd. According to the peace roadmap, the warring parties have committed to a nationwide ceasefire, improving living conditions in Yemen, and engage in preparation for the resumption of an inclusive political process under the auspices of the United Nations. The talks were heading towards success earlier this year, but the war in Gaza erupted and put the delicate talks at risk. A string of Houthi attacks targeting commercial ships in the Red Sea seemed to have derailed the most recent peace chance, which aims to end a decade of bloody conflict in the country. While some of those involved in the peace effort had expected an announcement about the plan to end the fighting could come before the end of this year, pressure to respond to the Houthi attacks has put the negotiations in jeopardy. To discuss the Yemen peace roadmap, join me from Los Angeles, فرناندو Carvajal. Fernando is a senior Yemen-focused researcher. He had been a member of the United Nations panel of experts in Yemen from 2017 to 2019. His works on Yemen have featured widely in different media platforms. Fernando, welcome to the program and Happy New Year.
Thank you very much for having me here once again, my friend. Happy New Year to everyone.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we straight away start with the peace roadmap announced by the UN envoy last Saturday, December the 23rd, according to the roadmap, Fernando, he says warring parties have committed to a nationwide ceasefire, improving living conditions in Yemen, and engaging in preparations for the resumption of an inclusive political process under the auspices of the United Nations. What do you make out of this statement?
Thank you. As I've said previously, it is a bit detached from reality. I believe that there was a need for the UN envoy to produce something at the end of 2023. After months of shuttle diplomacy between Riyadh, Muscat, Amman, and let's not forget New York in September of last year during the General Assembly. So there was a pressure for the UN to produce something at the end of the year, to sort of file a report. And this statement that was also published on social media is very vague, is very general. It assumes a lot for by a general public, and it doesn't connect to the reality on the ground, especially the talks between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. So we have to go back to early September when Saudi Arabia made another attempt at negotiating with the Houthis face-to-face in Riyadh since April 2022. And it is a very general statement with very optimistic at the moment when it was announced on the 23rd of December. And it continues to be detached from reality because we know also that a number of parties to the conflict were opposed to the general idea of this roadmap.
Okay, so of course your last words will bring me to the point of positions of warring parties regarding this roadmap here. And perhaps although the international recognized government welcomed the roadmap, okay, but also within this government there seem to be fundamental differences. And here I quote the example of the Southern Transitional Council, which is considered now part of the government. Okay, according to one official in the council, he said the council was not consulted about this map. How do you react?
This is a major point of contention between the Houthi rival parties, right? If we look back at September of 2023, for example, in the lead up to the UNGA meetings, the members of the Political Leadership Council who gathered in Riyadh just before flying to New York were complaining that there was a lot of backdoor negotiating and they were not included in those talks. Now, if we look between September and December, while the UN envoy had met with all the members, nearly all the members of the PLC, along with the diplomatic missions from Europe and the US, they continue to claim that these negotiations did not include them. And if we look at the composition of the PLC today, you have 3 members who basically represent the South. And then you add Tariq Mohammed Saleh, who would represent the GPC to some extent, at least in the figure of the Saleh family. And they continue to comment on the particulars of the roadmap, which they disagree with. So if you break down the roadmap in particular, one major issue for the Southerners in particular is the payment of public sector salaries, which is a primary, a center demand for the Houthis. And the proposal is to pay these salaries in the Houthi territories from oil revenue. And the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, continues to oppose to this particular idea because they want to negotiate how the oil revenue is spent, mainly that oil that comes from southern provinces. We also know that the Madib representative, like the governor, for example, who's a part of the PLC, the distribution of oil, fuel, gas to Houthis is also an issue for him and the elite in Madib, because they want to make sure that because the refinery is in Madib, that the province continues to take a share of this profit from oil and gas. Another point of contention is definitely the further lifting of restrictions on Sana'a Airport and the Hodeidah Seaport. Yeah. I mean, as we speak, as we meet for this interview, the Houthis continue to launch their operations along the Red Sea from Hodeidah.
Yes.
They continue to hold the Galaxy Leader vessel, civilian leader vessel in Hodeidah across from Salif. Yes. And the UN is talking about lifting further the restrictions on activity in Hodeidah. Yeah. When we know that since December 2018 in the Stockholm meetings, the Houthis were supposed to hand over control of Hodeidah Seaport, Salif, and the Safar terminal on Ras Isa. Yeah. So again, what we hear from diplomats is very much detached from reality at the moment.
Okay. Now, if we remain in the issue of the positions of anti-Houthi camp, فرناندو, and we discussed the STC. Now, if we just look at the GPC with its political weight, so within this roadmap, okay, it is said that the UN envoy will be engaged in consultations, political negotiations, etc., all these things. Now, and all these things should lead to what we call Yemeni-led dialogue. So how can we expect, okay, the GPC or representation on the table when some of its leaders are still under sanctions?
Absolutely. First, let's begin with the Houthi, and then we'll move to the GPC and multiple. So the Houthi have said very clearly that they will not engage in Yemeni negotiations until there is a deal between Houthis, Sana'a, and Riyadh. So this is step number one that is missing from the roadmap altogether. The Houthis are not going to move forward until there's a deal with Saudi Arabia. And that was one of the first initial reactions from the Houthis. Remember that the Houthis rejected, originally in April of this 2023, rejected the idea of Saudi Arabia playing a mediator role with their Yemeni rivals. Yeah. Now, when we come to the GPC, which would be step number 3 or step number 4 in this process, Dr. Rashad Al-Alimi, the head of the PLC, along with, let's say, Osman Mujali and Tariq Saleh, who by legacy would be associated with the Mu'tamar, have still remain, there's still concerns from their part, because let's remember, Mujali is from Sada, and the pro-government forces in Sada have been unable to make any gains against the Houthis in the north along the border. Tariq Mohammed Saleh is, and the Guards of the Republic are in charge of the Tehama, in charge of the Red Sea coast from Taiz to Hodeidah city, even though they've retreated from the airport, from Hodeidah airport. The other issue regarding the sanctions, let's say with Ahmed Saleh and Ali Abdullah Saleh, this continues to be an issue for the GPC factions outside of Yemen, right, outside of Sana'a, because they still continue to lack a central leadership figure. We don't see one in Cairo, we don't see one in Amman, and yet Ahmed Saleh has stayed on the sidelines. So when we look at the government today, you would think that the GPC would want to play a major role because the head of the PLC is a Mu'tamar member. The prime minister basically aligned with the GPC by legacy, and the speaker of the parliament, Al-Barakani, are from the GPC. Also, I keep reminding your audience and everyone when I speak about this, those 3 individuals are from Taiz. And we continue to see the failure by the UN to pressure the Houthis to abandon their positions that are choking the city of Taiz. And yet we see that on the roadmap, he continues to point to the roads in Taiz to be opened by the Houthis again, in the south, in the east, and now also in the west. So the GPC, in theory, would be very central to these negotiations. But they lack cohesion. We have to be honest. It is not a cohesive party at the moment, and they face a little, more of an uphill battle than say the STC, because at least the STC, the Southerners, seem to be presenting a unified front within the PLC.
Okay, but again, in the same point, Fernando. Okay, does or doesn't the Yemeni-led political dialogue necessitate lifting of the sanctions?
If the GPC pressures the UN in order to move forward as a leveraging point, as a point of leverage, then definitely lifting the sanctions on Ahmed, for example, Ali Abdullah Saleh, would be a central point for the GPC in order to begin that moving toward a central leadership. Let's remember that we discussed in your program, yes, last year during the GPC anniversary, yes, we discussed this issue of the lack of a central figure, right? A lack, yeah, of a central charismatic leadership. Yes. And if the GPC, when the time comes for Yemeni relations negotiations, the GPC is still technically a constitutional entity, yes, right? That is hijacked in Sana'a by the Houthis. One would figure that the GPC would look for a central leader, a central figure to lead the party, to bring it together in order to create a unified agenda prior to beginning those Yemeni talks, because you do want the parties from November 2011, the parties that signed the transfer of power from Saleh to Hadi, to be part of this dialogue as they were in the national dialogue in 2013, which is technically the central point for the UN envoy today,
Yes.
Even though it's a different envoy than in 2011 and 2012.
Yes.
The central point for the UN envoy's office is to return to that transition process
Yes.
that stalled in 2014 after the conclusion of the national dialogue. And that does demand the GPC, SLA, the Socialist Party, and other junior political parties to be part of that dialogue.
Yes. Okay. Now, if we turn to the Houthi attacks on the Red Sea, Fernando, and you have mentioned that in one of your remarks, okay? As we know that the United States formed multi-naval force in the 18th of December, okay? And just 2 days ago, the US Navy sank 4 Houthi boats and killed 10 militants. Today itself, Fernando, David Petraeus, the former CIA head, said that the US and the UK strikes on Houthis are possible, okay? So don't you think that all this put this peace roadmap into jeopardy or in jeopardy?
Let's keep focused. The ones that are endangering these roadmaps are the Houthis themselves. No other actor is escalating. No other actor is mobilizing troops. The Houthis are the ones obstructing this peace process under the umbrella of the rhetoric of the war in Gaza. The Houthis are escalating because, again, that is a Houthi tactic. Whenever we see news of progress and talks with Saudi Arabia or progress and talks with the UN, the Houthis find an excuse, find a way to escalate the conflict, whether it's in Yemen or against Saudi or the regional aspect, in order to position themselves in further strength vis-a-vis the rival negotiating partner. So this is a Houthi tactic. This is not the U.S. endangering the UN roadmap. But yes, the U.S. and the European powers have a responsibility, a global responsibility, to protect the commercial shipping lanes for the world's market. And definitely Bab el-Mandab as a choke point, as a global international maritime choke point, is of top priority to Europe and the US, not just Israel or Egypt. It's because of the Suez Canal. So the US does indeed have a dilemma at the moment where President Biden is being pushed now even by people in his own party here in the US to react to the Houthis. But so far, I agree with the response that has been drafted. Once again, I remind your audience that the Operation Prosperity Guardian has been framed as a defensive operation, military operation. So they've been very careful through the announcements, through the language they've used, to make sure that everyone understands that this is defensive. This is as part of an extension of other existing task forces. So this isn't a new task force that's being formed. It's a new operation that is being formed that is focused primarily on protecting the ships transiting through the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden through the Bab el-Mandab. This is a way for the Houthis to pressure the U.S. Let's remember that prior to September 2023, one of the Houthi complaints during the negotiations with Saudi Arabia was that the U.S. was obstructing the issue of sharing of the oil and gas revenue and the payment of public sector salaries. So this is more than just the reacting to the war in Gaza.
Okay, but Fernando, do you think that the US can manage to keep the roadmap or the Yemen peace roadmap from away or separate from the Red Sea attacks?
The U.S. can. The U.S. wants diplomacy to succeed. The U.S. wants the Yemeni parties to sit and reach a deal. But the U.S. is not going to sit back on the margins and allow the Houthis to target more and more civilian commercial vessels. This is an international responsibility for security. And so the U.S. has welcomed the roadmap. The U.S. welcomed Houthi Saudi talks, and the U.S. wants Houthi Yemeni talks. So again, it's not the U.S. that's willing to obstruct and willing to derail diplomacy. It's the Houthis who are bent on escalating the conflict primarily because the Houthis know that once they sit at the table to reach any type of final agreement, whether it's with Saudi Arabia or whether it's on the payment of salaries, the next step is pressure on the Houthis to govern in the areas they control or to begin the process of sharing power. The Houthis are not interested in any of these next steps. They do not want to govern because that means providing services to the civilian population under their control, and definitely do not want to begin the process of sharing power from Sana'a with anyone, not with the GPC, not with Islam, and definitely they know they're not going to be able to share power with the Southerners.
Okay, so a final point, if you may, Fernando, where do you see the future of this roadmap going to or heading to?
The definition of insanity is do the same thing over and over, expecting a different result, my friend. We've seen this in 2023. We saw this in 2022. We saw this in 2021. We've seen this since Martin Griffith at the Stockholm meetings in December 2018. Again, I will continue to say this. This narrative is detached from reality on the ground. The Southerners, furthermore to this roadmap, the Southerners have pushed that if the Southern issue is not on the agenda, they will continue to object to any Yemeni talks or even any talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. So the UN envoy is not doing a particularly good job at managing. Remember, this is conflict management. He's not doing a very good job at managing even the actors within the legitimate government. I think that they've done a very poor job at focusing on the primary role of the PLC, which was to unify the Yemeni parties to oppose the Houthis, right? That was the original intention of the creation of the PLC in Riyadh in April 2022. We continue to see fragmentation. We continue to see conflict between the parties that are members to the PLC. And so until there is a concerted effort by the UN and Riyadh to alleviate, to end that conflict within the PLC in order to present a unified front against the Houthis, we're going to continue to see delay, which the Houthis themselves would take advantage of in order to strengthen their position. We just saw that Mohammed Abdel Salam and Abdel Malik al-Ajri met with Iranian officials just yesterday or the day before, on Sunday, I believe. And so this just shows how the Houthis continue to strengthen their own position. We saw that the Iranians moved a Navy ship into the Bab al-Mandab area. This is definitely not to combat Houthi threats to commercial vessels. This is to help the Houthis to create a type of deterrence against the U.S. and European vessels that are there to protect the maritime flow, the maritime transit routes. So we can only hope for the best, that at least the Houthis sit down to begin talking about these negotiations. But in my opinion, we're going to go through another 30, 60 days of the Houthis kicking the can out down the road and opposing the UN envoy's efforts on the ground. Okay,
I'm afraid we have to leave it there, Fernando. Thank you again for your time and your insights, and thank you for talking to Yemen Today TV.
Thank you again for the invitation, and congratulations on another year for the Third Dimension. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. That's all for this time. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.